It's sorted now. Got the technician here to help me out. So could I have any nominations for chairman, please?
I nominate Paul.
Thanks, Karina.
And I just second it.
Are there any other nominations? Could I have a seconder, please?
Yeah, I said I'd second that nomination.
Yeah. Could
Yep.
I have a show of hands for all those in favor, please? Could you use the raise your hand function? Yeah, Paul, it looks like you've been duly elected, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your confidence and trust. We've got an awful lot to do this morning. The first item is to elect a deputy chair or a vice chair. Brian has filled that role for the last year very well, and if he would be prepared, I'd certainly like to nominate Brian as vice chair for School Forum.
Happy to second that.
Thank you. Then could I ask, are there any other people who would like to stand as vice chair for School Forum? I'm looking down my list and no. But Carol, have you? Nope. Okay. Then, if there are no others wishing to propose a vice chair, could I ask for a vote on Brian being elected as vice chair? Thank you. Using your hands. Have you been advised of any non-attendance?
Yeah, I have apologies from Kerry Clifford and Nick McSweeney.
Okay, thank you. If there are no others,
Okay.
It's in a small claim because they're a small school, but we haven't heard anything. But we've sent in the claim exactly to their rules.
It's been a bit hard for us because it was all done outside of the authority. We don't know who's applied and who's not. Maybe we need to just ask if we could get everyone to let Old School to let us know what they have actually claimed for, and then we can bring it. Ask the DFE about it, what's going on, because they said they'd paid everything that fell into those 3 categories and was in the financial limits.
Sian has also commented on the chat that she made a bid and received cash, or received funding. So if I could summarise where it sounded as if there is both a best practice sharing type conversation, and I don't know whether School Forum is the right place for that to happen, or whether there is a reimbursement of cost stroke understanding of how income might be sorted, that where School Forum may be a better place to gather that to then subsequently talk to DFE about funding. Is that a reasonable assessment? I don't think School Forum is necessarily the right place for sharing best practice. It might be the right place to gather an appeal or a bid or a presentation on behalf of Wokingham to bring funding back into the borough. Sal, have you got is that your hand back up again? Yep.
No, sorry, that was my arm getting tired. I forgot to put it down. My apologies.
Harold, thanks. Ginny, Brian, and you two as representatives of the secondary school heads and primary school heads, is it appropriate within your forums, to pick up the best practice piece, but perhaps within School Forum pick up the financial appeal piece?
Yeah, we certainly do share good practice across the Secondary Federation. I would have thought it was inappropriate to have this discussion at Forum because it doesn't have the full representation of all schools, and each school will be different according to whether it's an academy or a maintained school.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Jenny just said. The only problem with primary is we're not getting to give it as a whole as regularly, obviously, and Working Primary Heads Association certainly hasn't met so far. I'm not too sure when that date is, but I'm sure we can arrange something for it to be discussed.
Then, so if we recognise that this isn't the right or necessarily the right place for discussion about best practice, etc., is this the right place, and do you think it appropriate or even desirable that School Forum tries to assimilate some approach to DFE on behalf of Wokingham for, I'll say, funding in its loosest terms, whether that's refunding, whether that's make-up funding, I don't know what that might mean, but is this the right place for it? And do you feel we should be trying to do that? Sal?
Yeah, I would absolutely suggest that if School Forum wishes to put forward some representations through to the DFE, this is the place at which those should be composed. As the local authority, we're more than happy to relay those on behalf of Schools Forum through our engagement with the DFE, as well as through our finance routes to the DFE.
Ian?
Can I just make sure early years is included in all of that?
Well, sorry, yes, forgive me. I see you as part of School Forum, so yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do colleagues feel that there might be a position where an appeal through School Forum and Wokingham Borough Council could possibly blunt individual school appeals, or do you feel that driving both paths in parallel makes sense. Ginny?
I'm just a bit confused because we've just been told that the local authority doesn't know the position. So how do they know there's a position of an additional claim? So I just feel it's a bit cart before horse. If the local authority and its maintained schools have a clear pattern where there's not the reimbursement, then that's absolutely fine. But I think, forgive me, I think it's Catherine that was presenting, or Lynn, I can't remember, forgive me, said they didn't know. So I feel like we're having a discussion about something we don't really know about.
Lynn?
Hi, thanks, Paul. Jenny, if I could just pick up on that. So I think there's a number of themes in the report. Obviously, there's the exceptional cost scheme that the DFE ran, and I suppose what Catherine referred to is the fact that we don't necessarily know the specifics of what individual schools have applied to through that process. But what we've tried to highlight in the report is actually something much broader than that, so that there's financial pressures on schools that come from areas such as loss of income, other staffing issues, etc., which were not necessarily, they were excluded from the scheme that the DFE had. What we can obviously see and what we will pick up through regular and ongoing financial monitoring with maintained schools is what that looks like in terms of their individual positions and where that brings challenges. Some schools were already obviously facing really difficult financial challenges this year, and that's increased that. But we also expect within maintained schools there'll be a greater number who are now really struggling to balance their budget for this year. What we don't have is obviously the same level of information or intelligence about what's happening in academies. And I suppose what we wanted to have today was a little bit of discussion around actually, we are assuming that the same sort of pressures will exist across the borough for all schools. And, you know, whether Forum felt it was appropriate to be able to sort of collate some of that overall, not necessarily the detail of individual schools, but the actual, the sort of broader challenges that schools are facing with, regardless of whether you're in an academy or in a maintained school, and whether that provided some sort of walking on wide response through Forum that we might want to feed back to the DFE in support of schools across the borough. Does that help?
Thank you, Lynn. Are there any other comments? I'm not seeing any hands up or chat comments. Then perhaps in the interest of time, if I can pull this together, my assessment of the comments that have been made are that the primary heads group, the secondary heads group, and other groups may be the most appropriate place to be looking after best practice and other COVID-related activities. And there doesn't seem to be a drive for School Forum as a body to pick up the baton in terms of a Wokingham-based drive for recompense for the challenges that School Forum that COVID has brought. Does that sound reasonably appropriate given the conversation we've had? I'm guessing by no comments coming back that that's, if you'll forgive me, that's a reasonable assessment. Okay, then Catherine, if there's nothing further on the revenue monitoring. Oh, sorry, Carol, put your hand up.
I'm not fast enough at typing. I was meant to type a message. We don't actually know the extent of the problem. You know, anecdotally, speaking to business managers and other schools, there is a problem, but and each school's dealing with it individually.
Yes.
Could finance gather data on the extent of the loss of income to the schools? Because, you know, we've done our budget monitoring, but what it doesn't show is the measures we've put in place to try and mitigate what in our school is a nearly £50,000 loss. So it would be useful to know, I would have thought. So what I'm trying to say is our budget monitoring will show us with a very, very, very small deficit or small surplus, but that hides the fact that we've made significant cuts to mitigate that loss of income. So I think it would be useful for finance to gather the information on the loss of income in order to give forum a view on the extent of the problem, if there is a problem.
Yeah, we did in the summer term. We did ask the maintained schools to give us an idea of what their loss of income was, what they were expecting it to be. But obviously, we didn't ask academies the same thing. But we can.
Yeah, if I could just, sorry, Catherine, if I can just jump in there. So we've obviously referred to in the report that the level of loss of income that schools indicated just at the summer in terms of what that meant. Absolutely, Carol, in terms of budget monitoring and taking that forward, we absolutely want to understand with schools what the underlying position is. So for maintained schools, that is exactly the process that will be taken forward in terms of us working with individual schools, understanding what the underlying position is and the position that's there. And, you know, if there's the appetite for that, we're happy to feed that back to Schools Forum at a later date. So that will happen anyway. I think it's just, you know, we just welcome some opportunity to consider whether across all of our schools we wanted to look at that in a different position. Anecdotally from other Berkshire authorities, because we've picked up conversation with them around their approach and what they're doing. And again, it's the same thing. They know these pressures are there, but individual schools are making individual decisions to balance their budgets. So I completely agree, Carol, that in terms of us pulling together a summary from the process that we're going through now, we absolutely will do that, and that's part of the intention. Catherine's just picked up there the relevant paragraph in the report that from the 28 maintained schools that responded to us prior to the summer, they were indicating sort of 600, just short of 600,000 loss of income. We've set that against for our own information against individual schools in terms of balances at the start of the year, what was used in terms of setting a balanced budget for this year, etc., so that we've got a really good starting point to pick up with the next round of budget monitoring discussions with individual schools.
Thank you, Lynn. Then if Catherine and Lynn, if you can continue your activity to gather information from the maintained group, which supports this type of reporting, and if you feel it appropriate to share that reporting at School Forum, that seems fine. But I'm not getting a sense from the wider group that a Wokingham Borough-wide gathering or reporting of that information and representation here is desirable. So if there are no further comments, and with the action point that Catherine and Lynn will continue to pick up maintained school information and report back where appropriate, I'd like to move on to the next item. So I'm looking down. Does that... Thank you. If I can move... Oh, have I got... No, okay. Can I move on to item number 8 and ask for a very quick update on the contingency update?
Yeah.
Catherine again?
Yes, again. Yeah, so quick one. So the de-delegated contingency fund for maintained schools hasn't had any calls on it again, and the early years provider reserve fund was fully spent in 1920. We had just over 203,000 in the reserve fund last year, and it was fully spent. And that was due to, we had a new PVI setting, a new maintained nursery class, and 17 new childminders that came on board in the year. So that's why that was fully spent. We've got the early years task and finish group. We're going to keep meeting. We're going to meet again in January to discuss the formula going forward and how we can still report on the early years reserve fund going forward.
Thank you. Ian, as the one of the key reps for early years, I'm hoping that you are comfortable with this process of the reserve being then spent in the following, or being allocated in the following year, and that also you and your colleagues are having a share of voice in the process as part of the task and finish group.
Yeah, yes, much appreciated the recent payment from the contingency fund back to us. I think everyone appreciated that after this long, hard summer.
Okay, thank you. Could we move on to the DSG budget planning update? Again, I think it's Catherine.
Yeah, me again. So yeah, schools forum can note the content of this report, please. We've got the so this report's sorry, I can't get the words out today. Schools forum, if we want to provide you with an update of the budget setting timeline for 21-22 and indicative budgets and changes for the 4 blocks of the DSG. And we've also got an update from this task and finish group. We had the figures through for 21-22. We got a puff and stuff through, and we've had an increase across the board for all the blocks. We don't get the early years yet until December, but for the schools block, high needs block, central services block, we've had an increase. The central block didn't have an increase, sorry. Schools block and high needs block had the increase. The only things that changed for schools block was that the EDACI, the deprivation index, has been updated to 2019. They've included the teachers' pay grant and pension grant into the baseline. We can set the MFG between 0.5% and 2%, and we can still transfer 0.5% of schools block funding to another block. And the minimum per pupil level factors is now mandatory. For the task and finish group, we've since we've put these reports through, we've had the consultation back from schools, and we asked 5 questions. The first question was about MFG to keep it at 1%, and 88% said yes. Question 2 was about transferring 0.5% of the schools block to another block, and 52% said yes. Question 3 was about keeping the primary and secondary ratio 1 to 1.29, and 92% said yes. Question 4 was to move towards the national funding formula factors over 3 years, and 96% said yes. And for mobility factor, we were asking whether to move it towards the national funding formula, and 68% said yes. So it's quite interesting. We were going towards all of those factors anyway in our task and finish group meetings. We initially looked at the 3 lump sums there, 120, 135, 150, and 120 we decided was not fair to the small schools, that they were losing out, so we've scrapped that from our modelling now.
So forgive me if that was at pace and that there's nothing.
Sorry, yeah, I'm trying to get it out quickly so we can move.
That's fine, thank you, I appreciate that. Broadly, school colleagues after consultation were comfortable with the recommendations or the principles that you were putting forward.
Yes.
Some of those numbers sounded very close to 100 or were significant. I picked up 2 that I thought were close to 50-50. One was 52%, and I think that was quite a significant one. That's the 0.5% movement to the high needs block.
It's not. We didn't say to the high needs block specifically. We just said to move to another block, and that was 52% of schools were in favour of doing that.
And there was a second one which was 69%, which forgive me.
Yeah, 68% was the mobility factor. The rates are quite high for that for Wokingham, and we've said about moving it towards the national funding formula. So 68% said yes to do that, the same as the other factors.
Okay. Karina, you've got your hand up. If I can take your comments. Hi, Karina.
Can you hear me? Sorry, Paul.
Yes, we can now.
Yeah, I had a cluster meeting last week, and the question of moving the 5%, 0.5%, to another block wasn't clear, and all the head teachers agreed. Had they known it was the high needs block, they would have voted no.
Okay.
I was asked to feed that back.
Thank you. Yeah, that was okay. Thank you. Lynn.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Karina. Lynn, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that one really. That the 0.5%, it was the principles, because obviously the guidance is about the principles of it moving from the skills block to another block, and we wanted to ensure that was in there. The fact that there was 52% back was a more positive response than we've certainly had in the past, and to be honest, that we expected. But I do think, given that 52% was positive, it is something that we need to sort of explore further. So Ciara, your comments were really interesting, and I suppose I would what I would like to understand was that if the commentary was that if the high needs block wouldn't be supported, which of the other blocks would have been supported?
I think the head teachers would need more information, Lynn, about the different blocks and the reasoning behind it, and then they could make an informed decision.
Darren, I noticed your hand was up. You got and as chair of the Task and Finish group, could you share your thoughts?
Thanks, Paul. When we didn't necessarily talk about this much at Task and Finish, because Forum in the past has indicated that a movement of 0.5% from DSG into any of the other blocks wouldn't be something that we'd want to do. So Task and Finish didn't necessarily discuss that, and all the models we've used don't have that in. Can I just check on the consultation? Was it just a couple of points? Was it 52% in favour and 48% against, or the other way around?
52% in favour.
Right. And is there a breakdown of who the responses came from?
That's
so
interesting. No, there isn't. It's just it's all anonymous. And it's just we don't know, which is quite interesting actually.
Yeah.
Could you share the precise question or the precise line that people responded to?
Yes. One moment.
I think it worth our while, forgive me, spending a little bit of time, because by the 20th of November, the local authority have to apply for a disapplication if 0.5% is going to be moved from DSG to another block, i.e. high needs block. And we, as School Forum, are required to have shared our opinion about that movement. And as it stands, we've got a consultation where 52% of colleagues have said they would be prepared for 0.5% to move, albeit I have a feeling they don't know where it might move to. Mm-hmm. And we have a responsibility to share our opinion with local authority. Sal, whilst Catherine's trying to find her questions, you've got a hand up?
Yeah, I thank you, Paul. I think that's what's really interesting to me, and I think you're absolutely right, Corinna, around understanding what the other blocks may be. I think one of the things from a local authority perspective is also understanding that without that knowledge and therefore not being able to make an informed decision, how we can be in a position where we're saying, but we will not support to a specific block, i.e. the high needs block. The likelihood is, and again, in terms of listening to the opinion and hearing the opinion from Forum, as well as the consultation responses, the likelihood is that the local authority will make a disapplication notice by the deadline of the 20th, as Paul highlights. So we do need to be completely transparent and upfront with Schools Forum around that. But I really need to understand from the school's perspective as to why there's a differential between all the other blocks that potentially a 0.5 could shift to and the high needs block.
Karina, you've got your hand raised.
I think when we talked about it in my cluster, and there's 7 schools in my cluster, I think unless you sit on Forum, when you get a survey or you've got to make a response, I think sometimes it's quite difficult for people to really understand what they're being asked. And I think they need some more information about the different blocks, what the 0.5% actually equates to, and the impact that would have on then the school's block, to be able to make a fully informed decision.
The question actually said local authorities can transfer up to 0.5% of their schools block to other blocks of the DSG with Schools Forum approval. 0.5% for 2021 would be approximately 600k.
Okay. Yeah, I think they just need to understand what that means for them, Catherine.
Yeah.
It's very difficult when we talk about big numbers that people might not realise that that's actually going to have an impact on their school.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the confusion lies.
Okay.
Colleagues, we need to address this today, unfortunately, or within a very short period of time, because we don't meet again before the disapplication would need to be made. And as Catherine has read out there, the DFE requires us, School Forum, to make a recommendation that officers then use as part of their disapplication or not. So our option is to, as far as I can see it, and again in the interest of time, our option is to suggest that the question may not have been sufficiently fulsome in its suggested outcomes, or colleagues weren't sufficiently well informed, and therefore we override that and say yes or no, whichever way we choose. What are colleagues think? Do we go back out to schools again and say it's £600,000 being transferred from the DSG to the high needs block? This will result in a lower funding for your school. Do you still agree? We need to have some recommendation to move forward. Brian?
Yeah, I think we need to be very transparent about this, because, as Karina said, schools don't know where this money's going. And I think I'm concerned about how the high needs budget is being managed. So I think that schools really need to know where that money's going to make that informed decision. Otherwise, I don't think it will go down well.
And do you have an initial thought as to how we might gather that new understanding from schools in the relatively short time period we have?
Unless they've got time to put another survey out, or on that particular question only. I think it's the only other way, isn't it? Unless it goes through clusters, but we've only really got a week, haven't we?
We've got November the 20th.
Thank you.
Karina?
Yeah, I think given the situation we're in with COVID, and that budgets are so tight, I think schools need to really be able to understand how this is going to impact on their individual budgets for them to make a decision. I know that's really hard on the high needs block, but we're all facing possible deficit budgets, and if we lose another 2,000 here or 1,000 there, it could have big impacts on our offer to our children. I think schools need to understand that fully. So although we're saying 600k, they need to understand what that means for each school, or how that affects per pupil funding.
Okay, thank you. Liz has commented on chat that she agrees with the suggestion that is coming out that we may need to go out again. Ginny, you had your hand up.
Yeah, good morning again. 2 points. I don't think the percentage is terribly high to give Forum a strong confidence it's a good decision. Presumably Forum is made up of people representing and who have a strong and confident knowledge of the blocks, and so I don't think you need to go out again. Personally, I think Forum is in a position to recommend or not today.
Thank you. Carol?
I was going to pretty much say the same as Ginny did, that does Forum have to accept that vote because it is very narrow, or can we make a decision as a Forum?
I'm pretty sure we can make a decision as a Forum, and for want of a better word, ignore that vote. Ben, I think you had your hand up as well. Hi, Ben.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you. I think I fully understand the points that have just been made, but I think that question did ask an in principle point of head teachers. I mean, if you're going to allow 0.5% out of the DSG block, it's going to reduce your school budget. It doesn't matter where it goes, it's going to reduce your budget. And more than not have voted for that. When we think about how tight Brexit was, we're talking about a very close, narrow thing. However, it is true the question was not very specific, and I think a lot of people probably weren't entirely sure what they were voting for, or the specifics of that. And that's a big decision to make. I think that we should go back out and put out a very clear survey back out to head teachers to give their feedback on.
Thanks, Ben. Sal, and then I'll come back to Ginny.
Yeah, thank you, colleagues. I think that we are, as the local authority, having gone out to head teachers across the borough, I think there is an expectation that we do listen to the results of that. However, I also fully understand and appreciate the comments around the specificity of the question. More than happy for us to develop and go back out to all head teachers with a more detailed question on this specific point as a survey, and then be able to respond to that accordingly. Very much along the lines as Ben has outlined around the matter of principle around the 0.5% question, as well as making sure that schools understand what the implications are in terms of making that sort of decision. And I think if we were to take that approach, then what we'd probably be seeking from Schools Forum today is, given the time date of the disapplication notice, is an agreement to progress on that basis, and then progress dependent on the outcome of that short survey question.
Thank you, Sal. Okay, I've got Sarah has commented on chat that she also thinks the question wasn't sufficiently clearly stated. Lynn, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just really, I think Sal's probably really put better than I could what I was going to raise, but I suppose just to add on to that, just both sort of expanding out from this particular discussion as well about where we are required to consult with all schools, how we as a wider group build enough knowledge to allow that to be a useful exercise going forward, so that actually when we're putting things out, that we have confidence that schools have the right information to be able to know what they're answering, or feel that they could come and talk to us if they're not clear and they need more information. Because we will, whether it's this or in other areas, we will need to and want to continue to consult with all schools. And I just feel we need to make that, get to a point where we feel then that schools are returning those as in an informed way as possible.
Thank you. Ben, have you got another comment to make? I've got your hand up. No, great. Okay, thank you. If I can then pull I think Ginny's point is absolutely right. We certainly have the authority or the responsibility to, if we felt, override the consultation figures that have come in. I get the feeling from what I've just seen on chat and from people's comments that we may well be better advised, or we lose little in going back to schools and saying, with this particular question, this is the impact, please, would you consider your response, and making it clear that the 0.5% would detract from their budget and would be going into the high needs block. Darren?
I wonder if it might be, building on Jenny's point, worth Forum voting today as an indicative vote, and that might form part of the information sent out to all schools as part of the consultation.
Other comments?
If I may, Paul, what I wouldn't want to do either way is prejudice the consultation with all schools. So I would suggest respectfully, Darren, that actually we don't make any reference to specifically a forum position on this. Clearly, as representatives, you can go back to your constituent schools and explain your position. But in terms of how the local authority might want to consult with all schools, we wouldn't want to preempt that by saying Forum has already determined its particular view. We would like to leave it open.
Okay, Shirley, I think you've got a point as well.
Yeah, it was just to say, I think as somebody who did do the vote, I think it was written in such a way that it was so vague that it wasn't helpful for people to comment on. So I'm not confident of how it would go back out. So I'd like Forum to see how it's going to go back out and how it's going to be worded before it does go back out, if we're not going to take a vote today. So it's really clear when it goes back out to schools what is being said.
Okay. So could I then ask initially, do we believe that going back out to schools is the most appropriate approach, or do we believe that our position in this particular consultation, and we do have, I believe, the ultimate responsibility to recommend yes or no. Do we believe we should exercise that without going out to schools? Could I potentially put that to a vote, unless somebody's got something they'd like to raise before we vote on that particular point? I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment, so could I then ask you please to vote on, and the choice is we either go back out to schools with an improved question, taking Shirley's point, it needs to be properly formulated, or we, as school forum, take a view and do not then go back out to a further consultation. Could I ask you to vote on not going out to a further consultation? I'm looking for hands going up, and I've not seen any hands go up. Just to make sure everybody's clear, could I ask you then, and I appreciate this is the opposite side and therefore there technically isn't a need for it, but could I ask you please to indicate whether you believe going back out to schools with a better formulated question is the approach we should take? Thank you. I'm seeing a raft of hands running down the list. So I would like, please, therefore, that we do go back out. I think Shirley's point is well made. Sal, Catherine, Lynn, I'm not sure where in your team the question gets formulated, but I think we need to charge you with designing that particular question. I'm suggesting that it is clear that the 0.5% moves from DSG to the high needs block, and I'm suggesting that some of the language in there recognises that therefore individual schools' budgets will be less than they would have been if the 0.5% hadn't been moved. We probably need one or two people who are going to review that particular question just to make sure that we're all comfortable that it works in the right way. We're not going to be able to meet again to do that. So we'll also need to identify one or two colleagues who will review it and say, yes, that's great, and out it goes. Any comments to that? I've got Sean. Sean, are you there? No? Yes? Yeah, gotcha.
Hello, yes?
Yeah.
I think that's right. I did try and put my hand up. Hopefully you saw that.
Yes.
So I agree.
Thank you. Ben, I think your hand was up.
Yeah, I've just typed on my thing. I think that could be delegated to the Task and Finish group to check.
Thank you. Darren?
Just to clarify that if it does move, 0.5% moves from DSG, is it intended to go to high needs block, Sal, or is there any for central services? Because central services has got that reduction this year.
I think that what we would be looking for, as we have previously, was predominantly around the high needs block, but certainly in discussion with Lynn and Catherine, we'd be exploring the central services element, but predominantly we're looking to the high needs block.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Could I quickly take Ben's suggestion that it's the Task and Finish group, so Darren and colleagues who review the text of this consultation question, and upon their approval, the officer team send that out and gain replies as quickly as possible. Does that, if anybody's got an objection to that, if they could put their hand up, or an alternative suggestion, perhaps rather than a suggestion. If not, great. Thank you, Ben. That's we'll take that. Darren, are you happy to pick that up with across the Task and Finish group, you and your colleagues, to review whatever language is drafted by Catherine, Lynn and Sal, ready for it to go out?
Yes, that would be grand. If Catherine could produce a draft, we can have a look at it, certainly.
Thank you. Colleagues, the next piece is, are we, and I'm not, I think the answer has to be yes, but forgive me, I need to, are we therefore prepared, whatever the result coming back from that consultation, when it's added together, do we as school forum accept that as the disapplication or not? So if it's a If it's 51% in favour of disapplication, then we as School Forum support that consultation, even though it's clearly very close, and ask officers to submit that by the 20th of November. Could I have any comments? Lynn?
Yeah, sorry, just to add, so if timings were different and if there was a majority support of that approach by schools and Schools Forum were going to stand by that, then we don't actually need to submit the disapplication request. We only need to submit the disapplication request if Schools Forum don't support that way forward, and as a local authority we still felt that was appropriate.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for the clarification. Any other comments? Then, if everybody is comfortable, we will proceed with that approach. Hang on. Sarah, yes, you've got a comment. I think I'm asking a different question. Could you forgive me if I've got that wrong? Or is it Shirley? I'm not sure. I've got
No, it's Sarah. I do think we're asking a different question. Okay. Because you're asking a specific question as to whether to move it to the high needs block. Shouldn't the question also be asked whether Forum can move money between blocks, which was the original question I think that Lynn was getting at in the first place? I just wanted to make that comment. I don't think you need to change anything that you're doing. I just wanted to comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Then from my notes, Catherine and colleagues will draft some text of a single question. Darren and the Task and Finish group will review the language of that text. It will then be issued by way of a consultation. The feedback will be gathered. I'm pretty sure we have sufficient time. I would suggest, rather than have no correspondence, I take the responsibility with Luciana to gather whatever the consultation feedback is and share it with all members of School Forum, even if it is that no matter what the outcome, and then based upon that outcome, we School Forum support whatever the percentages are, and the local authority then either applies for a disapplication or not, depending upon that outcome. Is everybody comfortable with that? Could I ask if anybody isn't, perhaps I could ask, if everybody's comfortable, could you please put your hands up? Thank you. I'm seeing a vast majority in favour of that approach. Thank you very much. If we could move on to item number 10, school admissions. Sal?
Yeah, I'll just gear up to share my screen. 2 seconds.
Whilst you're doing that, Sal, Ali, I can see your hand. Oh, okay, it's gone down again. Don't worry. So.
Right, hopefully colleagues can now see that.
Thank you, Sal. Yeah.
I am conscious of time and therefore hope that colleagues have had the opportunity to read through this. As you will all be aware, we have been thinking about for some time about the development of a school admissions task and finish group, but as a kind of subgroup to Schools Forum, to replace what previously was the school admissions forum within the local authority. Unfortunately, with the pandemic and response to pandemic, that has been delayed and delayed and delayed, I'm afraid. However, starting to re-pick up on the activity now in terms of both the drafting of the terms of reference for the task and finish group, as well as looking to a first meeting of the task and finish group in early November. And what I would like to do, again, in order to save time in this meeting, Port Chair, is ask that colleagues note the creation of the task and finish group, note and comment on the terms of reference for the group, which I'm more than happy to take outside of this meeting, Chair, in order to save time, and support that the first group of the task and finish group will formally adopt the terms of reference once fully amended. I'm not intending to go into any greater detail than that, but more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And appreciate your recognition that we're running short of time, and therefore some of this may need to be taken outside of the meeting. Can I ask colleagues if there are questions on the paper that Sal has presented, and particularly anything that's key inside those terms of reference that may need to be considered? I'm not seeing any hands go up. Sal, I noticed that you've got a membership structure. Can I ask how you might appoint, or how you might elect, if that's the right word, to that membership structure?
I think that what we would be looking to do is go out to schools, as we do for Schools Forum, and ask the various federation or groups around nominating representatives for those sectors, rather than us as the local authority determine specific individuals. I think for the first meeting, what we'd previously agreed was that the membership would start with those members that had been on the previous school admissions forum, and at a previous schools forum, I think a number of other colleagues had also expressed an interest in being involved. So our understanding was that we would start the first group with that cohort of colleagues.
And then the primary head teachers federation and the secondary head teachers then review that with a view to possibly replacing or enhancing that group, but ultimately ending up with 7 representatives across the task and finish group.
It would be the 7 across the primary secondary phase, another one in terms of diocese response, and again, I would want to be in that meeting thinking about making sure that our special schools are also included, albeit the admissions arrangements sometimes are different for those schools.
Okay. Are you anticipating that the chair and vice chair would, even though I appreciate you have the ability that they are not, are they likely to be members of that group?
That's what I would anticipate, yeah.
Fine, thank you. Are there any other questions, or Shirley?
The only thing I'd suggest is on the schools where you have 7, my suggestion would be to put an additional membership of somebody from a special school there as member, in addition to the 7 places already available to schools.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, for example, Shirley, have an additional notional role, that, or not a role that is a representative of a special school.
Yeah, so potentially where you have a head teacher from 3 secondaries and 4 primaries, a head teacher from at least one head teacher from a special school in addition.
Absolutely. I think that was an error and an omission on my part in drafting of these, so I'll absolutely build that in.
I think it was agreed at a previous fall. I think when I think somebody did, either Jay or Sarah had volunteered anyway, I believe. But I didn't want. I thought it would be better than losing a place from the current 7 places suggested. So just my suggestion.
Brilliant. Thank you. If there are no other questions, then Sal, thank you for that time-saving but nevertheless comprehensive approach to the schools admissions term, the task and finish group. If there are no further questions or points, could we move on to Piers and the Growth Fund strategic update? Hello, Piers. I saw your name there earlier on, Piers.
I'm here, yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll try and keep this fairly brief and not read the whole report, which I assume you've already read. Basically, I'm trying to set out the background to the Growth Fund rather than the whole background to our planning for future provision. That's important because the Growth Fund is only up to age 16. And we, as a council, have duties to consider the needs up to certainly 18 or 19, sixth form provision, and up to age 25 for young people with high levels of special education need. Okay. In our work looking at the Growth Fund, we have to look at the local birth rates, the impact of migration, and the number of children moving across the borough boundaries for their education. I would regard independent education and home education as being secondary factors, not least because they seem to be relatively static numbers of students. But of course, the numbers, particularly for secondary, might come and sting us, particularly if there's a sort of major change in employment in the borough and people can no longer afford independent education. So it's a risk, but so far it hasn't seemed to have been a major issue for us. We don't have a statutory need to plan for future school provision. We used to have, but we don't these days. But we do have a duty under law to ensure that there are sufficient places. And you either plan for that strategically and in advance, or you're reactive. And our experience of being reactive is it's pretty well impossible to do that very well. You end up having to make the decisions around about the time you make the allocations, and that leaves you 6 or 7 months to put additional provision in place. And very often it arrives late, and it certainly arrives just in those schools where we're able to put bulge classes in. So it really worked very poorly when we waited until we saw what the numbers actually looked like. The current position is that we are expecting to see, and indeed are seeing, growth around the strategic development locations, the major housing developments in the borough, and our future local plan update, which is an activity some of my colleagues are engaged in at the moment, will lead to basically a new population geography. The borough has been very keen on concentrating development into a relatively small number of locations, and the consequence of that is that's where you will see change. And those growing numbers, if the development had been more distributed, might have been supporting school roles in other areas. Of course, that doesn't work very well if you've got what's effectively a large new village in what was previously a rural location. So the moment we have the two strategies, the primary strategy, which as I say was particularly noting that we were likely to see static or decreasing demand in areas without housing development, but certainly rising demand in the SDLs. And we have a secondary strategy, which is pointing for up to 100 additional year places at some point, year 7 places from 2019-20. But the borough is very much at the mercy of cross-border movement. It's a very important factor in our school roles. And one of the things that we see as demand rises locally is the number of out of borough students coming in has fallen. But you could see changes in the number of our students going out of borough at the moment. They're rather different characteristics. For example, we have students going to grammar schools in Reading and Slough. And plainly, there are no students coming into this borough for equivalent for grammar school education. Just looking fairly briefly then at what we've seen very locally at the moment in terms of development, we've certainly seen that house building in the Shinfield area has led to a very rapid growth in primary demand in that area, very localised, and we've been able to open the new Alder Grove. We moved from a position last year where we had just enough places to this year where we needed 30 extra places. So that is quite a big proportionate jump for a relatively small area. Demand has risen in Arborfield, but not to the extent yet where we need additional capacity, but it's definitely an upward trend. We expected that Woodley would need additional demand. If anybody's read the previous strategy, in fact, numbers have risen, but they've only risen to the level of the current capacity, so there was no need to put additional capacity in. And we are aware that there are shortfalls in other areas. The question is, how long is that a permanent state of affairs? And what would, two questions, if it's is it a permanent state of affairs? And if it is, what do we do about it? The secondary capacity, so far, we haven't needed to put additional capacity in. One interesting feature, and I think it happens in a lot of areas, not just Wokingham, is that the numbers that you see on offer day are not the numbers that you see by the start of school in September. Particularly in the secondary sector, there's a very significant fall in the total demand. I think it's 4% difference effectively between the allocation position and the position by the beginning of September. And that's really meant that whereas we had to over-allocate at a number of schools, the numbers fell right back, and we do now have some surplus capacity. But we can't rely on that for the future, so we have to be thinking about what we're doing to create additional Year 7 numbers, which will stick probably from next year. Okay, so we have some growth fund. For the growth fund, we know that we've got some existing projects that are still being supported, and they'll run out of support in the fairly near future. That's schools that have opened over the last 10 years. We're expecting that the Matthews Green and the Arborfield primary school projects in the near future will require support at the point where they open, so that will be a drain on the growth fund. We do know that we're not expecting, although we've got plans for another school in Wokingham Town, Spencer's Wood and Arborfield. They're not immediate future plans, so we're not expecting them to have an impact on the growth fund in the near future. And we have no thoughts that a new secondary school will be required within the next decade at the moment. But we will have this need to support Year 7 growth. And that's primarily because we expect the secondary growth to be a bulge as the primary numbers work their way through and the falling primary numbers work their way through. House building is a big issue locally, and one of the key concerns, not for the immediate future, is what's the impact of house building given national planning policy. Many of you have seen the actions of Councillor John Halsall quite recently highlighting the issues of changes to national planning policy. They could have quite significant impacts. The number of homes being built each year could more than double. And whilst 800, going from 800 to 1600 is still a relatively small proportion in any one year, you can see that over a decade, that's an awful lot of new housing stock and a lot of land that gets converted, and a potential requirement for quite a number of new school places. And worth mentioning here that COVID-19 may have slowed house building initially, it ceased, but the house builders are back on site and they're reporting to us that they've got significant future build programmes. So we're not expecting this to be anything other than effectively a momentary delay from what we know at the moment. Policy background, apart from the schools, I said about the education policy, we have no need to establish formal plans, albeit is a good idea if you don't want to be always caught on the hop. The borough has national planning policy, has planning strategies which are a result of national planning policy and national planning legislation, and that's led to us creating these idea of these 4 large-scale developments. Embedded in those plans are the plans for the schools that are within them that you're seeing unfolding at the moment. So that's the Bohunt and the primary schools that we either have built or in the process of building or at some point are likely to build in those SDL communities. And they were all effectively pre-planned at the point at which that policy was that strategy was adopted in 2010. So that becomes quite a major a factor for us in determining where schools go. I think I'd just point out a couple of points about, very briefly, about what the kind of issues that we have. Our demography, because of the national planning policy, is somewhat uncertain. The Office of National Statistics is pointing to us to the primary age children dropping from 2020 to 2033. So they're suggesting that numbers will fall. But who knows what the implications of housing numbers will be, because who knows how many houses will be built in that period. If it's the level that existing new policy points to, then probably we're not going to see a fall, but we will see the numbers concentrated in specific developments. And we are looking for an increase in the number of secondary school age children we're likely to see over that period up to 2025. And then, as we're expecting from that point, the numbers are decreasing, and that's broadly in line with what we're expecting from our roll data. And effectively, we will see the sixth form numbers will continue to rise, certainly for most of the next decade. But that's not important for the growth factor that I mentioned that in passing. But it's something as a borough we will need to plan for. I did a table just to show you very brief analysis based on offers by area of what proportion of offers come out of new housing. This is just based on the age of the postcodes. New housing developments get new postcodes, so most of those new homes are easy to identify through that mechanism. And just looking at the postcodes from 2015, you can see that in some areas up to a third of the pupils are coming from new homes. They are very, very significant factors in those areas where new housing is seen. And whilst in Woodley the housing is largely built out, we know that in Wokingham Town, East and West, and in the Southwest, we're still very much in the early to mid phases of the housing development, so we can expect those numbers of students to start rising. If you wondered what the impact of housing was, there's the evidence that the housing is bringing children into the borough. It's having a marked effect on demand in those local areas.
Yes, can I ask what's the age profile, or is there an age profile across those new young people coming into schooling, or is it fairly evenly spread from 5 to 16?
This is an analysis. Actually, you always reread things after you've presented them and think, oh, I should have written that. This is based on the primary allocations, so I haven't done the same exercise for secondary. What we seem to find, though, we know from national statistics and our own experience, is that the rising numbers come through, first of all, in early years. They then come through into the primary sector, and they tend to work their way up into the secondary sector. So what I would anticipate if I did this exercise, I'm probably going to do that, is that for the secondary sector, we'll find smaller proportions are coming from the new homes. Although we do have families that move, particularly locally, within those, within the borough. So it doesn't necessarily attract so many families in, but we certainly get a sort of geographical resorting as people move into new housing. But yes, I would expect it to be much more marked in primary than it is in the secondary sector. But these numbers will work their way through. Okay. I just wanted to talk very briefly about travelling to school, because that's actually a major concern for us. I think one of the concerns I know that you have as a forum is the fact that we are trying to create new provision at a point at which we know that roles are declining in other areas. And I suppose the point I'd make about that is that it's actually quite problematic. The more we have to expect children to be bussed around the borough, that's quite problematic for families, but it also can be quite problematic for schools, because we know where we have to make placements away from the family's home, they're often quite transient placements. Basically, parents take them until such time as they can get a school place closer to their home. So it's an activity that, in terms of the long-term need to maintain standards in schools and in terms of the interests of the children, is not necessarily something that works to everybody's advantage, even if it props schools up in the short term. We also have issues in terms of our wider interests as an authority and what the implications are in terms of traffic congestion and in terms of carbon footprint. One of the key purposes of concentrating development in specific locations was to ensure that the impact of development wasn't spread and impacted upon the existing communities. And I think, in a Woking context, traffic volume is a very important consideration for the local community. So if we dislocate the education provision from the home location, we inevitably get very large numbers of children transferring or coming into schools in the cars, and that is something that local communities feel very strongly about. And there's a piece of work that was done by a national survey by Department of Transport survey data, which really just told us, I suppose, what we would know from common experience. If you've got a journey of less than a mile, and in fact I believe in other information I've seen really it's less than half a mile, most children will walk in to school. Soon as you've got that distance between going up towards 2 miles, there's a dramatic shift, and most primary age children, 1 to 2 miles, will be driven to the local school. And that's still below the statutory walking distance, but we've got no mechanism to make children walk to school. And as soon, of course, once you're beyond 2 miles, pretty well all of them are going to be driven to school. Slightly better for secondary, but even so, once you start getting beyond 2 miles, very small numbers of children are walking in or cycling in, for that matter. It's buses and cars that are being used, but secondary age children at least do use buses. And as I said, the COVID-19 impact, we are keeping an eye on it. What we don't know, of course, is, given that we have no vaccine, is what's going to happen over the next 6 months to a year. And I think that's a big unknown for us all. Is that sufficient?
Thank you, Piers. That was wonderful. If I look at the secondary school children 5 miles and over, and they're not walking, bicycling, car, van, local and private bus, what are they doing? What's the other?
I actually have absolutely no idea. I suspect it means that they haven't got the information. But no, it's interesting. 5 miles over. Yes, I can't think what that might be. I'm tempted to say boat, but I suspect that's not the answer.
Colleagues, Piers, thank you very much for that. Shirley, you've got a question or a comment you'd like to make? I think you got your microphone. That's it.
Sorry. Here's a couple of questions. On page 46, I note that there's a likely need for up to 100 additional Year 7 places from 2019-2020. I'd just like it to be noted that I have got 135 places in Year 7 available. So that's the current 2019-2020. So I'm just like that noted there. So I'm not sure where that number has come from, that there was additional places required. So certainly weren't filled. And I know there are other secondary colleagues who have got places in Year 7.
Can I just come back on that and say, absolutely, what the issue is that this is taken from the projection. The projection simply reflects the way the world worked at the time when the projection was done. What we see, as I mentioned in the report, is actually the number of children from out of borough tends to get squeezed out. So on offer day this year, we certainly had exhausted our capacity. Certainly, no co-educational girls' places. We'd had to over-allocate to ensure that all the girls had received offers. The numbers then fell right back. And of course, you have a position where you're able to provide boys' places, and certainly on boys' places, I wouldn't envisage that there's likely to be a problem for the next few years. But don't say that that's absolutely out of the question. You could be full, but girls' places certainly we have to see as being a question mark. And you have to look at it from a borough point of view and say, well, what's the percentage of the total borough places that are available? You're in a very unfortunate position, but most other schools are actually fully subscribed at the moment.
I choose to disagree, Piers. I know that Embrook have places for girls, for example. I know Wangels have potential places going forward. And I have asked in the past that we look at the capacity for the current Year 7 to 11, having 560 places available.
Yes, absolutely. Embrook, Wangels are the only schools that have surplus capacity, but they don't have a very high number. That's been fine for this year, so I wouldn't dream of putting capacity in for this year. I'm certainly not at the moment thinking that we need to actually invest. We simply need to be. I think really what it's a matter is, if we have to over-allocate at schools, then we have to say to those schools, and the numbers stick, is what support do you need? Do you need support from the Growth Fund to make this work? But the numbers are coming through from the primary sector. The issue is much more that a very small number of schools are where we see the surplus capacity being shown. Your position is quite atypical to most other schools in the borough.
So would it be perhaps helpful, and perhaps in hindsight, but the comment about the additional places perhaps needs further clarification, that it's not a net number across the borough, it is a reflection of particular circumstances in particular areas?
It is a reflection of the very large numbers that are still coming through, will be coming through from the primary sector. And it reflects the way in which the projection methodology works. It could be, as I said at the beginning, at the moment we've squeezed out a number of out of borough residents. So you may see that actually that phenomenon means that we don't have an issue across the borough. But equally well, if some of our students who are going out of borough find that they can't and need to get places within Wokingham, you could find that actually the position changes quite markedly. So I think we have to be aware that we could be in a position where we have over allocated, and we had to over allocate quite significantly on offer day, that by the time we get round to September that we haven't got a surplus capacity. Wangels and Embrook were both fully, and indeed in the case of Embrook, over allocated on offer day this year. What's happened is that the numbers have decreased. Primarily, that's students going into the independent sector. I think I would say most of that movement, from what I can see, is definitely movement to the independent sector. Some because the parents tell us that that's what they've done, and some because the parents, they don't tell us, but where else would they be going? Because if it was simply churn, they'd be replaced by other students. They just tell us that they don't require a Wokingham school place. If for some reason, for example, COVID led to large-scale redundancies amongst higher waged earners, they were unable to afford those independent school places, then we could suddenly find ourselves having a significant problem to manage. Hope not, but it's possible.
Karina, you'd like to ask a question?
Yeah, Piers, can I ask, is Matthews Green School open for admissions for 2021, please? I know my governors would like to know.
Well, that's a discussion. Well, we're still having a discussion about when it opens, but my expectation is that it'll be delayed to 2022, but there is a formal process that we need to go through internally to confirm that.
Okay.
And when I say 2022, I would expect that we would review it at that point as well.
Okay.
Because it's a school built to serve a new community, there's a considerable degree of uncertainty over what's happening to house building and to new communities over the next year.
Okay. When will that decision be made, Piers? Do you know?
I would imagine we're going to make the decision on 2021 probably within the next month. I can't see it'll be longer than that.
Okay. But, and how will that be disseminated to schools, or how will we find out? My governors are very keen to know, when it's going to open and what impact it might have on us as a locality. So how will we find that out, that information?
Well, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't drop an email to all schools once we've made that decision.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
That'd be the simplest way of dealing with it. We'll do other publicity as well, but given that you've got a direct interest in it, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. It's not that onerous.
No, and also I think, I've had another look at the admissions in September. I don't know if it's changed, but there are still surplus places in all the primaries and infants in that locality. So that would be a big consideration again. But thanks, Piers.
Yeah.
Piers, you say we will make this. Can you suggest which particular forum's a bad word in this context, but which particular group it is that makes that decision?
Oh, I think that's effectively will be a decision by the director. No doubt in consultation with the lead member.
So it's a member-based decision.
Well, it'll be. We wouldn't do anything without of a fairly serious nature of that kind without consulting it. But I don't think it'll be a formal decision. Yeah, I don't think that it's a kind of executive decision at that moment, for example.
Interesting. Okay. Shirley, I think your hand's come back up again.
Yes, please. Sorry, I don't mean to go on, but just two things really. Travel to school. I think it's interesting to note that since COVID, certainly I've experienced a large number of students are now cycling to school, which is really encouraging. So actually, based on the data we produce, it's probably changed quite a lot, Piers, which is really good, I think, for the local community. I've had to put in 2 extra bike sheds, so it's just something for us to note that it has been one positive I found from COVID. And just in terms of capacity, Piers, could I ask 2 questions? One. You've mentioned 4% normally kind of go movement. What capacity are you finding go to private schools or the 11 plus schools. So I think if that was taken into consideration in the planning, and in addition to that, could we look at the numbers in all secondary schools and primary schools currently and have an updated plan? Because I know the last plan I've seen is quite dated, I think it's 2010, so it'd be good to see where all schools are currently, because current numbers allows capacity going forward. And I understand the boy-girl mix, but equally it would just be useful to have that data as to how many students are actually in all year groups currently with a new plan. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley. Thank you, Piers. I'm looking down. I think, Piers, thank you very much for the update. Thank you for the report. It sounds like there's a couple of further questions that we'll be asking you to come back with some information on. But if there are no further questions, thanks again for sharing that with us. And I'd like to move on to Sal, who I think is back with us for item 12, High Needs Block Update.
Hi, colleagues. Yes, I am back. Sorry, I had to disappear shortly during that last item. Again, hopefully colleagues have had the opportunity to read the papers in the pack. The recommendation is that School Forum notes the content. In essence, I think it's fair to say that this report is twofold. Firstly, in terms of giving some update in respect of where we are in relation to SEND strategy and the developments that are taking place there. Colleagues will be very well aware that one of the key actions that was part of our written statement of action was the development of a SEND strategy, which was completed. However, as part of the improvement board activity, we agreed that we felt that we could go further and that actually a strategy should be something that's not just solely consulted on, but actually co-produced. So we're currently going through a process of co-producing a new strategy that will replace the existing strategy that we've got in place. The task and finish group of the SEND Improvement Board that's been developing that is very clear and near to the conclusion of final draft as a co-produced document, which we will then look to go formally out to consultation with other key stakeholders around that, in readiness to hopefully be able to adopt that strategy from December of this year. So you'll have seen hopefully that the outline timetable within the pack. Again, other actions that are part of the written statement of action, but are also informing our strategy and our thinking going forward, is the development of our data and performance reporting. This was an area that we clearly needed to make sure we had the proper oversight of our performance and intelligence in terms of understanding what's happening within Wokingham. And what we continue to see is that our total of education, health and care plans continues to increase. So the increase over the last year, August to August, in essence is a 21% increase in EHCPs. And clearly that then has significant impacts on the nature of need and provision, and how that provision is, and how those needs are met through provision. We have improved quite considerably our performance in terms of the timeliness of our EHCPs and also in terms of the quality, which we're seeing through multi-agency audits of activity. Areas that we are aware of and that we continue to respond to in respect of our EHCPs is ensuring that our communication with schools and colleagues improves, because we're very clear and colleagues have been very clear with us that actually that's still an area that is wanting, and so we're absolutely looking to how we make sure that we improve that, but also ensuring that we've got the right evidence of voice of child and family, again, as a critical key component in EHCPs. And to that extent, we are just agreed within the SIB a new EHCP template that should hopefully draw that out much more acutely. We continue to, or we've started to recommence a lot of activity that had been suspended as our capacity within the council was redeployed in terms of the initial COVID response. So we are revisiting and restarting the work around mainstream top-ups, our resource bases, the work in terms of new bandings. So those sorts of areas of work that we had commenced and had slightly paused, we are recommencing, and we'll be looking to make sure that we've got the full engagement of schools around those areas as we go forward. In terms of some of the basic update in relation to Northern House that I know Forum has had interest in, the improvement work commenced in Northern House at the beginning of September, so the start of the school year, where Chiltern Way Academy were commissioned by the DFE to work alongside and within Northern House School on the commencement of improvement activity at the setting. Similarly, we believe and we are hopeful that Chiltern Way Academy Trust will become the new provider for Northern House School as of the 1st of November. And all plans are moving forward towards that. Clearly, one of the key areas, and we'll pick up on this in terms of the higher needs block deficit element, is the utilisation of our independent and non-maintained provision. And again, whilst we've seen the 21% increase in EHCPs, in terms of how that need is then met, we've seen a significant proportion of quite a significant increase in our need to utilise independent and non-maintained special schools, which clearly has an impact on spend. So again, we've seen almost like a 3% increase in terms of the placements within special schools. We're continuing to work through some of the other funding arrangements that we also need to review and bring up to date. So our engagement around foundries, the Pupil Referral Unit, and our tripartite arrangements with health and social care, to making sure that actually we are maximising the efficiency across the partnership in terms of funding of the placements as appropriate. Catch my breath before I kind of dip into the or move on to the high needs block and the budget deficit arrangements, as was seen in the previous paper around the revenue monitoring report. There's a significant movement in terms of what was last reported to Schools Forum of in excess of just £1 million. Much of this is contained within three core areas. So the out of borough maintained, so an increase in what we are seeing there, an increase in terms of post-16 learning, and most significantly, as I've just stated, that increase in terms of independent and non-maintained provision in order to meet need where we cannot meet them within the borough. That particularly has had a marked impact on that high needs block deficit increase. Again, as I said, hopefully colleagues have had the opportunity to read through the paper, and I and colleagues, I'm sure, are more than happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Sal. First up, Jay, I noticed your hand up a couple of times.
Thank you, Paul. I've just got a couple of questions, if I may. The first one relates to Appendix B from Agenda Item 7 with the Foundry College budget line. which shows a September forecast with an additional £19,000. Whilst I wouldn't wish to give it back, I have no idea why or where that 19k has come from. So that's a complete mystery to me. Secondly, I know that what we asked for previously was transparency in funding, which is why the different provisions have got their own individual budget lines. So I find myself looking at the Northern House budget line and the budget of 720k for a provision that has, according to the catch-up premium, has 67 places, I believe. I just think 720k is only part of a funding line that goes to Northern House, and I wonder where the rest is, because in their expenditure last year it exceeded 2.1 million. So I'm a bit worried about that. And the third point is that on the schools block, de-delegated, so behaviour support services shows a reduction, a variance of 22k, which is quite correct. It is the reduction due to further academisation of the primary schools, but that money actually goes back to, or goes direct to the primary schools, and is not de-delegated to Foundry, and yet it's reflected in the surplus deficit line, and I don't think it should be.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Lynn, thank you for popping up. I'm hoping you're going to be able to answer a couple of those questions.
Yeah, certainly, hopefully I can. Jay, so just in terms of your first point in regard of the 19,000, that was around some inflationary uplift assumptions that we'd actually set out when we set the high needs block budget, but then realised that that hadn't been properly reflected in the forecast previously. So we can pick the details up that with you up outside the meeting if that would be helpful.
Yes.
In terms of second point around Northern House, so you're right in terms of top-ups. It's the top line in terms of high needs academy recruitment, so place funding, etc. for academies sits within that line as well. So it's unfortunately just the way that is, that in terms of the recruitment, if you like, is sort of happens right at the outset, and then the rest is around top-ups and other arrangements, if that makes sense.
It does. So is all of that high needs academy recruitment for Northern House?
Catherine, I think so, but yeah.
No, it's not all because it's to do with post-16 places in academies as well.
Then listening, and Jay's point is correct in terms of we're trying to get some transparency. I think it would be helpful if we split that line called High Needs Academy into the piece that belongs with Northern House and add it to the Northern House piece, and whatever remains. So sure. There's again this clarity that each of the resources and what they're costing.
No problem, we can do that. Yeah. And then just on your final point, Jay, around the de-delegated, yes, I completely take on your point. I think in the way we present the information, and historically that's been the case, but that's something myself and Catherine we're actually discussing and pulling this report together. So I think we're going to look at how we make that a little bit clearer, that in terms of there, it's not an underspend or a release back, if you like. It just reflects the changes in funding arrangements during the year. So we will look at that presentation for a future report.
Okay. Paul, sorry, could I just ask one final thing? Who holds the budget that has now appeared as alternative education, 100k? Catherine?
I'm hoping maybe? Catherine or Lynn, somebody's going to put their hand up.
Yeah, so that's effectively where we've tried to, and again, we can look at how we reflect some of this, Jay. So that was from a finance perspective of us trying to be clearer about where there are arrangements in place for EHCP. So it might be a multitude of little things and arrangements that are in place for individual EHCPs that have been agreed through the SEND service and panel. Okay. So it's not the budget for assetting, if you like. It's okay. Just it's a number of individual smaller arrangements.
Then perhaps we can look at a slightly different description for it.
Okay. Yeah, certainly we can do that.
Thank you.
as you can imagine, I've got a number of numbers type questions. I'm looking down the list. Have others got questions either on the specific budget figures, I'll come back to that, or on Sal's presentation of this evolving high needs block strategy, on SEN strategy? Ginny?
Yeah, good morning. One of the things that has constantly sort of dogged the high needs block is the sort of paucity of information in terms of numbers and where children are. Could Forum have a oversight, please, of how many ECHPs there are in each year group from preschool to post-16 and where they are placed? So, for example, how many children in year 6 are in which schools in Wokingham, are in which schools outside of Wokingham, and in which independent settings they're in? I would just be very interested to see that. I asked this because I've asked on 2 or 3 places, and honestly, nobody's been able to tell me, which makes me nervous that nobody knows.
Lynn?
Well, yeah, just to pick up on that, Jenny, I completely agree, and we have discussed it before. The intention for this meeting of Forum was to bring back that level of detail along with the multi-year budget model in terms of being able to take Forum through that. We took the decision because the forecast had moved so much and some of our baseline assumptions in the modelling therefore need revised, and because this was all coming out in the run up to this meeting, that we took the decision to just take a step back and review those assumptions before we bring that back. But absolutely, that level of information we fully expected to bring back to the December meeting as part of a wider pack of information for thinking about budget setting for next year.
Thank you for that. Can I just follow that up? So last meeting I asked whether every child in year 6 was placed into year 7, and there was some question there wouldn't be. I now know that was not the case, because on the 17th of August St Crispin's was instructed to take 3 high needs children that we were not expected in the middle of the summer holidays, where there was no opportunity for transition or the recruitment of staff. And I am more than disappointed that that has occurred, because that means that there are children now in a mainstream setting who are not suitable for a mainstream setting, who I will need to call early annual reviews for, and they should not stay here, which means that's another 3 places that will need specialist school setting. It just is a worry, isn't it?
Any of our officer colleagues have a thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that there is a concern about making sure that we are able to both identify and resource the appropriate provision for all of our children with SEND. As Lynn says, we are working, and we will, for December meeting, be able to give much greater detail and clarity in terms of our phase transfer arrangements. They are always very, very challenging, as colleagues will be aware, both in terms of consult activity, responding to parental preference, and looking at what are the settings that from a SEND perspective we do believe can meet need, hence why we consult. We do take into account the consultation responses that comes from schools, but clearly there is a significant capacity issue in terms of the resources available in order to meet those needs, both in terms of the provision within borough that clearly we would want for the vast majority of our children, but also in terms of those particular specialist schools that we don't have provision in borough, that therefore we do, and being able to identify and find those placements in a timely fashion is something that's incredibly challenging. So I don't think, Ginny and colleagues, I would disagree with that point in any way, but I think there is a real response that we're trying to make from a local authority perspective in terms of how we commission and how we work, but also in terms of how we want to be working with schools around, all schools around how we meet those needs and find the available resources within the borough.
Ginny, do you want a quick comeback on that?
I'd just simply say that I've been on Forum since 2014 and I've heard the same promise about the future for every single one of those academic years. And as somebody who's been here for all of that time, I don't see any difference.
Sal, there's a challenge for you. Yeah.
That is a real challenge, and I think part of the issue with that is that if we don't see a difference in the system in terms of the resource availability, it makes it incredibly difficult around how you reshape the way in which you approach, and we are seeking to try new approaches and new ways in which we can resource things in order to respond to some of the challenges that we collectively face in terms of supporting these children.
I don't think anybody underestimates that task, but several of your predecessors have equally made commitments and worked hard to move the few levers that you've got to make it work. And perhaps, as Ginny is saying, there's been almost a decade where it hasn't sadly moved the lever, and the budget deficit has just continued to increase. Shirley, you've got a comment as well, I think.
Yeah, thank you. In addition to that, you've just mentioned budget as well. I think the gap between the funding in special schools and the funding in mainstream schools that go with an EHC is quite an issue as well. So potentially we could support more children in the borough in mainstream schools if the funding was increased. So the top-up funding is still way below what would happen. So when that child then has to go to a special school, the additional funding and the additional cost to the local authority is quite a difference. So that would potentially help funding and support more students within the borough if we could appoint staff appropriate to support the students that we're having in.
Absolutely, and I think I refer back to, like I said, some of the work that unfortunately had paused over the initial wave of COVID-19 in terms of the restart of that reviewing for mainstream top-up arrangements that I allude to at the top of page 58. So I think we're not averse to considering and having those conversations about what a future profile might look like.
Thank you. Shirley, do you want to come back on that? Or
less experience than Ginny, just been in the borough for 3 years, and Sal's predecessor as well. I've heard this before and I've raised this personally in terms of top-up funding, so actions would be great on this and I think might save us all going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. My struggle, part of it, and Sal, I appreciate there's a huge amount of work going on within the borough to try and look at the resource base and realign it. And 1/3, £7 million, is going out of the borough is being used for independent special schools. 7 million out of 22 million, 1/3. Normally, you focus on the single largest item and work out where there are opportunities to make changes. That 7 million is based upon a budget of less than 6 million. So in the space of 4 or 5 months, it's increased by over 25%. It just feels like that one line, the single largest line, is uncontrolled. I won't say out of control, it's just uncontrolled. And of all the things that I would have hoped, and it may be happening, but it certainly doesn't seem to be having any impact, is some incredibly hard-nosed negotiation with whoever is charging these sorts of sums of money, because clearly it is straight to the bottom line and causing the major part of our deficit. Sorry.
Yes, I think Forum needs a much better understanding of the tripartite funding that Sal mentioned, because it's not just a question of education provision. A lot of the high costs that are in the independent and non-maintained special schools come from the fact that families are not being supported by social services at home and don't have enough respite. So even though schools may be able to manage those needs, families are not able to manage those needs at home. and we have very few respite places in Wokingham. So the tripartite funding, I think, I don't know if you agree with me, Sal, is a real issue because social services, social care and health need to be basically putting money in, because it's not just about education. A lot of these residential provisions obviously are needed to be funded by everybody. So I think Forum needs a better understanding of tripartite funding.
Absolutely, Sarah, and I think that's why, again, highlighted in the paper to Schools Forum, that a significant piece of work around getting into that tripartite funding arrangements and being really, really clear around how we attract in appropriately social care and health contributions to those independent, non-maintained out-of-borough settings as appropriate. I think that historically it's been an area that hasn't had the level of robust agreement between the tripartite partners, which is something we're really trying to nail now.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my understanding, and when I've been involved, health have rarely played a part in this.
Thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I was just going to absolutely add to that, Sarah and Sal, that not just within Schools Block consideration, but actually, across services, so in adult social care as well, actually health funding in our side of Berkshire is the lowest in the country, and it's something that's a constant at the forefront of discussion and has felt in previous years a bit of a constant battle in terms of ensuring that that's right. So there's a lot of discussion strategically, not just in relation to our high needs block, but generally about how health contribute appropriately to individual packages.
I'm very conscious of time, but don't want to curb this conversation. Of all of our conversations, this single item, high needs block, and the fact that it is responsible for £6 million deficit that we're carrying forward is very important. Lynn and Sal, I appreciate your commitment. I appreciate COVID has not helped in terms of getting information to School Forum for this meeting. It clearly becomes very important that we have that information for next meeting to help you make some decisions and perhaps provide a bit of backbone to some of those decisions and possibly sponsor some of the conversations with other parts of the authority. But the way it is looking, we'll end up with well over £3 million deficit compared to budget this year, and you'll be carrying forward £7.5 million worth of deficit on the bottom line, which, whilst it may not be significant compared to many other authorities, it is still a huge amount of money relative to Wokingham's overall reserves.
Absolutely, Chair. Absolutely.
I do wonder whether we might almost have I won't say a special meeting, but a separate meeting to enable us to focus on the matter and not find, as I'm afraid we have now, that we're sort of running to the end of the meeting and almost having to wrap it up before everybody's had an opportunity to understand what's going on. We'll consider that later. Can I ask colleagues, are there any further comments that you'd like to make or requests for information in the pack that Lynn and Sal are going to bring to us at the next meeting? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands go up. Then thank you for that piece, Sal and Lynn. I'm conscious that we're running very short of time, and I promised that we would finish at 12. We won't, but there is one item that requires a vote, and therefore before I lose a few of you who may have other commitments, I'd very much like to bring any other business item onto the agenda before we then tidy up with the remaining items that are for information rather than voting. Sal, could I ask you to bring forward the general request for disapplication? And Darren, could I ask you for the moment to drop off the call? I'll send you a text to say when we've got over and you can come back on. Is that okay?
Yeah, will do. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sal, if you could present this one item of AOB.
Yeah, I can, but I'll probably immediately hand over to Catherine, who can probably explain it a lot better than I can. In essence, the AOB is in relation to the MPPL funding and the new arrangements. But I will pass on to Catherine, who can describe it better than I.
Yeah, so the minimum per pupil level funding factor has been made compulsory in the funding formula this financial year, and this for next financial year actually includes the teachers' pay and pension grants as well. The primary schools all get protection of £4,180 per pupil. Key Stage 3 gets 5,215 and Key Stage 4 gets 5,715, protecting the formula. The way that it actually works for all through schools is they do it calculates an average across all the year groups, assuming that each year group from reception to year 11 have the same number of pupils, and the rate for all through schools for next financial year is 4,695. So for our all through school in Wokingham, it's not the case that their numbers are the same. Their PAN for reception to year 6 is 30 and the PAN for year 7 to 11 is 203. So 80% of their pupils are actually in secondary years, and they're actually protected at much lower rate than pupils would be in other secondary schools. So we're proposing that to do a disapplication request to the ESFA by the 20th of November deadline, and we are hoping that Schools Forum will be in favour of that to make sure that the school is funded equally as all other schools are in the borough.
Ben, and then Ginny. Ben, you got your microphone off, Ben.
Thank you. Yeah, right. I'm on the task for this group, and we put this out about the group to recognise there is a shortfall, and we all agree there should be at least the minimum funding guarantee received by pupils at the Alter, at the Piggott. Nick and other secondary heads on the Secondary Heads Federation have also, vote to support that decision as well.
Thank you. Ginny, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to confirm, the Secondary Federation believe it is the right position to ensure fair funding for the Piggott.
Thank you. Carol?
I agree with the decision that people have made, but what I really don't fully understand yet, Catherine, is whether this is the funding that's coming from the DFE, or are they being funded in the same way as everybody else? It's just the allocation that's different.
So ask the question again.
Sorry, so when the funding comes down from the DFE for the children in Piggott, do they get the same level of funding in the block that's coming from the DFE as the rest of the children in the borough? It's just the way, at the moment we're just talking about the way we allocate the total pot to Piggott.
Yeah, that's right. So the money that we get through from the DFE is split between primary and secondary, the PUF and the SUF, that we get the income that we get in. Oh. And it's the way that it's distributed out through the tool that doesn't treat primary and secondary and all through school the same.
Okay, thank you. That just backs up my comment that I agree with the this application.
Then, if there are no further questions, could I move to a vote? There's a vote required before the local authority or before the officers are allowed to make a disapplication request. The Schools Forum has to genuinely vote on it, and the outcome of that vote is noted on the documentation that then goes to DFE. So could I ask us, please, again, no further questions, could I ask us, please, to vote on the approving the disapplication request for Piggott? I'm seeing an overwhelming, it looks like unanimous, an overwhelming vote that the disapplication request for Piggott is to be made. So, Catherine, Sal, thank you very much for that. That's great.
Thank you, colleagues.
Could we move on? And again, I recognise if anybody needs to drop off, please do. I've not met my promise of 12 o'clock. I'm hoping that we won't take much more than 10, 15 minutes maximum to cover the rest of the agenda. Lynn, could we move on to item 13, insurance?
Yeah, yes, certainly. And first of all, I think...
Sorry, hang on, sorry, before you do it, Sean and Brian, I think, have got something they'd like to chip in. Sean, you've got your hand up. No, okay, fine. Sorry, they've gone. Sorry, Lynn, off we go again.
Okay, no problem. So the report was brought today in terms of bringing an update on the initial meeting of the Insurance Task and Finish Group, which was, we discussed in previous forums about setting up to look at the pros and cons effectively, and a bit more information about Maintain Schools being able to join the RPA arrangement that was brought into place for this financial year. Obviously, the eagle eye amongst you will notice that there are clearly gremlins in the report, and the fact that there is only an X under financial implications and next steps is not that there are no financial implications and next steps. It's just for whatever reason the published version didn't pull through the right version. So apologies for that, and we'll ensure that the full report is sent out for your information with the minutes. Just in terms of covering very quickly where we are, so part of the discussion and the information gathering that we've been doing is around experience from elsewhere, so experience from our academies within Wokingham of what they feel about the RPA. We've asked in terms of other Berkshire local authorities where they have maintained schools whether any maintained schools did take the opportunity to go down the RPA route, etc. this year, and that's sort of allowing us to gather a bit of an evidence base in terms of feedback. From an overall perspective, feedback has been fairly positive about the RPA arrangement, the claims process, etc. for the schools that have found that very useful. From a council perspective, what we've been looking at and what it does tell you in the report is our current insurance contract runs through to 2023, and that we don't have a separate schools insurance contract, if you like. The council tenders for insurance as a council contract, and schools are part of that. So in terms of financial implications for both options, we recognise that the current arrangements where schools, maintained schools, have their insurance arrangements through the council, on the face of it, are significantly more expensive than if you were to go through the RPA route. Looking at that and homing in on that, we have reflected a little bit in terms of how we offer insurance, and the fact that a significant chunk of it is taken through the de-delegated route, and then there are other options available for schools to purchase out with that. Given that what we are trying to do is inform a position going forward for schools to make individual choices for themselves on whether they want to remain within insurance within the council or whether they want to go through the RPA route, we recognise that actually that de-delegated position was a little bit of an obstacle in there, and the terms of that we're taking that annual vote for maintained schools to continue that way or not to continue that way. And it didn't necessarily allow individual schools to make truly individual decisions. So what we've agreed in terms of next steps is that we will continue to gather experience from other maintained schools and academies of what they've found on the scheme. We are putting forward that we will no longer offer insurance as a de-delegated item for the 21-22 financial year. So the council will obviously still offer insurance, but it won't be through that de-delegated route. So as a local authority, we're proposing that we will remove that from a de-delegated decision. And then over the coming weeks, we're going to re-look at the funding and the recharge model for insurance for maintained schools to see how we can come up with. We can't compete with the RPA rates under the current contract, we know that, but we're going to look at the funding model and the cost to individual schools to see how we can try and drive some of that cost down a little bit, so that we will bring an update in conjunction with the Task and Finish group back to Forum in December, which then hopefully gives a much more visible and hopefully a more cost-effective option for schools to consider, and then make individual decisions for next financial year and whether they remain with the council or whether they go through the RPA.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. So, do you need anything from this group today, i.e. an agreement that yes, it should be removed from the de-delegated fund, or are you comfortable that might be something that you bring to us in December when we start to look at the detailed budget?
So I think, I mean, I'm proposing today that we are, that is the way we will go forward. We will assume that we were not going to offer it as a de-delegated option. So I think if anyone has any significant concerns or comments with that, then yes, absolutely. The Task and Finish group was of the view that made sense, but I'm happy to take comments from anybody else if they feel differently on that.
Colleagues, any comments? Carol, I remember your insurance was something that you had identified as being a challenge. Yeah, go on, Carol.
I'm happy with that suggestion to take it out of the de-delegated for the reasons that Lynn suggested.
Thank you. Any other colleagues with comments, or shall we await the further progress? So assume that it will be taken out of the de-delegated, and that Lynn will come back to us at some stage in the future with how the how the local authority may present an insurance option as an alternative or as a further consideration compared to RPA. I'm not seeing any hands. Thank you very much for that item, Lynn. Moving on to school improvement grant. I know this is Gillian's baby, but I can't. I don't know whether Lynn or Sal would like to handle it, or Catherine.
Yeah, I was just.
Go on, Lynn.
Thank you.
So I was just going to run over quickly. So this was, again, came about through discussion at a previous schools forum about the school improvement grant that the local authority receives. It's obviously not within the remit of schools forum decision making, but we did agree that what we would do in terms of visibility is bring some information back on the grant and how it had been used. So really, I'm not going to go through the detail. It's there for you to read, but we really just to set out some confirmation about the amount of improvement grant as an example over a financial year that we've received. The fact that it's not ring fenced, so actually, there are no particular conditions about how we use that. But in recognising some of the capacity building across the system that we're looking at within the authority, and in consultation with a number of schools, some of the work the School Improvement Service has been doing in conjunction with educational psychologist team and other colleagues is exploring the use of a therapeutic thinking approach. Put out some basic details in the report, and I am obviously not the expert on the detail of that to comment on, but we just wanted to give you a flavour of that and confirmation that is what the school improvement grant was set aside to look at options, and that's what that's going to be used for in the short term in terms of taking forward that approach and ensuring that it's embedded across the system. And we've just referred to some of the reasons again about trying to link that back to the SEND strategy and the management of the deficit management plan in terms of how we build capacity through a range of options across the system as we move forward.
Thank you. Colleagues, any comment on this use? It's maintained schools only, isn't it? Forgive me, if my memory's correct.
For the grant is yes, but the actual therapeutic thinking approach is thinking more broadly across the system. So yeah.
So thank you for the update. Thank you, or if you could thank Gillian for the paper and the report. And I'm looking. There's nobody asking questions or raising any points. Thank you very much. If we could move on to item 15, which is Luciana's going to give us a quick update on school forum membership. There's a page, agenda item 15 in your pack. Luciana, can we come back to you?
I was just unmuting myself. Yes, I think I will also not take much of the forum's time. I think the paper is a reflection of the numbers of pupils within the borough. You can see in the appendices where we are and how the calculation was made. There's been little movement. As you can see, some primary schools, since last time we reviewed, have now converted to academy, but the overall recommendation is that we continue with the same membership. I think that's the summary. I don't know if you want to add anything, Paul.
Thank you. I'm sure colleagues will remember we have a responsibility annually to look at the membership of School Forum and ensure it reflects the phase and the structural arrangement of young people across Woking Borough. Luciana has prepared that. Despite a number of primary schools have transitioned from maintained to academy status, but even with those small changes of numbers, it looks as if the representation is still appropriate for young people across the borough. So the recommendation is that we retain the membership structure, so that's primary schools, secondary schools, academies are maintained and that we retain that for the next year. Can I ask if there are any questions initially? And if there are not, I'd like to move to a vote so that we can formally accept that, if that's what everybody's wish is. I can't see. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, just like to say, I did contact Esther with her academy chain to see if there was someone to fill that position, but I've not heard anything back yet, because that was a position that we were looking at.
Yeah, thank you. Shirley?
Sorry, just a note for accuracy on page 75, it has Fiona Wood, Business Manager Forest, but she left obviously and I took that place, so it's, I've been doing that this year. So I'd like that to remain if that's possible, thank you.
Thank you, we'll pick that up. Then thank you. If there are no other questions or comments, could I ask for a vote, please? So put your hand up if you approve this recommendation that the membership of School Forum remains as it is at the moment. It's cost, and I'm seeing an overwhelming, unanimous decision that yes, it should remain as it is. Thank you very much. If I can add one other little piece, thank you for a number of you. I think it was over half of our members replied to the feedback questionnaire that we sent out. There isn't time for me to take you into it. Broadly, it was, and I'm very pleasantly surprised, very positive. At the next meeting, I will give you a little update on the areas that are still open. There's always a chance for improvement where we can still improve things. If there's no other points, I'm going to look around. Has anybody got any other business? Sean, I think you've got your hand up, or is that still hanging over from the vote? If rather than me go down every single person in the list, which I would normally do, can I ask if anybody has any other business? If you could put your hand up, now's the time to put it. And Sarah has some, yes? No? You've gone? I can't see anybody's hand up. Then might I thank you all for your attendance today. It was a very busy agenda. Thank you for the officer group for presenting the documents as they have done, and look forward to speaking to you all in December. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.